Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Radu Alexander, so be sure to show him some love in the comments, subscribe and ring that bell if you haven't, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. Let's get to it. The mid to late 19th century was not a good time for the relations between the United States government and the Native Americans. Instead, it was a shameful time marked by betrayals, wars, broken treaties, and massacres. As the government confiscated more and more land for its own purposes, many Native Americans showed that they were willing to fight and even die to maintain their freedom and preserve their way of life. Some men took on the role of protector of their people during their greatest time of need, and few, if any, were greater or more determined than Crazy Horse, the Lakota leader who fought and won at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. As with many Native American figures, Crazy Horse's history, particularly his early years, has been passed down through oral tradition. Fortunately, some of his relatives have shared the tales of their great ancestors, so we have a good idea of Crazy Horse's life story from the Lakota perspective. Crazy Horse was born in the fall of 1840, although other years have occasionally been cited. He lived in the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory as a member of the Oglala Band of the Lakota people, one of the groups that make up the Sioux Nation. He was the son of Crazy Horse and Rattling Blanket Woman. Our Crazy Horse was actually the third one, because his grandfather was also called Crazy Horse, or, to give him his proper Lakota name, Tashanka Wheatco, which is better translated as his horse is wild or his horse is spirited. For the Lakota, it was common to adopt multiple names throughout their lifetimes, especially following a big event. That's why our Crazy Horse was named Ka'oha at birth, meaning among the trees, or in the wilderness. As a child, he had smooth, light skin and curly, light brown hair, which is why he was also called Curly, or Zizi, meaning light-haired one. If he wanted to become the new Crazy Horse, he would have to earn it the same way his father did. The elder gained the name from his own father when he was 15, after counting coup and killing his first enemy warrior. At that point, the original Crazy Horse passed down his name to his son following a ceremony called a hanblecha, and then adopted the new name Walks with Sacred Buffalo. We just used an expression you're probably not familiar with, counting coup, and we probably should explain it. Counting coup meant tapping an enemy on the head with a special stick and escaping unharmed. For many Native American warriors, counting coup on an enemy was more prestigious than simply killing him because it was far more dangerous and difficult. The reverse also held true. Having someone count coup on you was a massive humiliation for a warrior, so you can bet that many of them would fight fiercely even to the death to prevent that from happening. Anyway, back to our Crazy Horse and how he earned his father's name. When he was 14 years old, it was time for him to begin his own hanblecha, a vision quest that would reveal his purpose in life. The hanblecha lasted 4 days, but he had to do it once a year, 4 years in a row, before his journey was complete. When it was said and done, Cha'oha accepted his role as a warrior and protector of his people. It was in 1858, the same year that he had finished his hanblecha, that Ka'oha earned his new name. During the fall, a Shoshone war party invaded their lands. One of the warriors attacked a young Lakota woman cleaning buffalo meat in the Powder River. He beat her to death with his club and then charged after her young son, who ran away in terror. But Cha'oha saw this happen and sprang into action, riding fast and catching up to the Shoshone. He hit the warrior from behind and killed him with his club. Afterward, he rode solo towards the Shoshone war party, who, fearing that a larger group wouldn't be far behind, turned tail and ran to their camp. But Cha'oha stayed in pursuit and even counted coup on some of the slower riders. It wasn't until the Shoshone reached their camp that they realized that Ka'oha was all alone. So the roles reversed and they began chasing him. But the young warrior had faith in his band. He knew enough time had passed for the boy to reach camp and alert the Lakota. And he was right. As the Shoshone made it over a ridge pursuing Cha'oha, it said that Ka'oha killed 3 warriors that day, so his father decided to honor his achievement the same way his own father did for him. The elder Crazy Horse adopted the new name Waglula, which meant worm. And from that point on, Cha'oha became Crazy Horse. You know, I was shocked to learn how much of my personal information was with data brokers, and with today's sponsor, Delete Me, I found out that 18 of these companies had my personal information. Data brokers are companies that snatch up your personal info and sell or rent that information for a nominal price. And it's not just social media websites. They get this information from all over the internet, including government public records. Now, I'm pretty careful when it comes to what I do and don't do online, but you know something? You can never be too careful. This information included my name, age, past addresses, family members, marital status, and my wife's name as well. And with Delete Me, I was able to get it removed from these websites. Now, full disclosure, you can absolutely do this on your own. But if you're like me and you don't have the several hours it would likely take to follow that process for every single website that has your information, Delete Me will help keep your data more secure by doing all of that for you. So if you want to have a little more peace of mind when it comes to your private data, you can get 20% off Delete Me US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/biographics and use promo code biographics at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/biographics, code biographics. During the 1860s, relations between the Great Plains tribes and the United States government descended into war. Because of the danger and strength of the enemy, the Lakota allied with the Arapaho and Cheyenne to take on the United States Army. As far as we know, Crazy Horse first took up arms against the United States during the Colorado War of 1864. The conflict began following a gruesome event known as the Sand Creek Massacre, where the 3rd Colorado Cavalry under John Shivington attacked and destroyed a Cheyenne village while the warriors were away, killing mainly women, children, and the elderly. Even back then, this horrified and outraged the public. But despite an investigation and a court-martial, Shivington's only punishment was being asked to resign. Unsurprisingly, the Cheyennes sought out retribution. They set their sights on Julesburg, Colorado, a way station on the Overland Trail close to Fort Rankin. They attacked in January 1865 and burned it to the ground. But Crazy Horse was not yet with them. His father just had another son named Comes Home Last, and to the Lakota, children always come first, so he was with his band enjoying some family time. Crazy Horse joined the fighting following the summer solstice, just in time to take part in the Battle of Platte Ridge. Just like Julesburg, Platte Ridge was a stagecoach station, rather than a proper town with a military outpost nearby to protect the wagons passing through. The Great Plains warriors knew that the US Army outgunned them, so they relied on raids and ambushes to weaken their enemy. This time was no different. 2 warriors acted as decoys by climbing a telegraph pole and cutting the wires. Afterward, they rode away slowly, giving the impression that their horses were lame. The soldiers bought the act hook, line, and sinker and started chasing them, thinking they would be easy pickings. Instead, they rode right into an ambush and were surrounded by Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. The soldiers fled back to the outpost, although 5 were killed on the way. Right around that time, a wagon train with the worst timing in the world approached the station. The soldiers fired their cannon to warn them away, but other than that, there was not much they could do. There were around 100 soldiers in the outpost, but the Lakota and Cheyenne numbered over 1,000. So they left the wagon train to fend for itself, which it did near the Red Buttes by the river. 3 lucky blighters had been sent to scout ahead when they heard cannon fire, so they made it to the safety of the outpost. The others, however, put up a valiant fight, killed 8 warriors and injured many others, but inevitably were slaughtered to the last man. The following year, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho teamed up again to fight the US Army for control of the Powder River Basin in Wyoming. It became known as Red Cloud's War, named after the Lakota chieftain who led the Great Plains troops. Like the war before, this conflict mainly consisted of small-scale raids and surprise attacks, particularly on the 3 forts in the area: Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith. There was, however, one notable exception. On December 21st, 1866, the Native warriors gave the American Army its worst defeat on the Great Plains up until that point, when it led a detachment of soldiers commanded by William Fetterman into an ambush and killed every single one of them. It happened a few miles north of Fort Phil Kearny. This time, Crazy Horse had a prominent role as he was one of 10 decoys who lured the soldiers into the trap. After repeated raids on the fort, the troops inside were a bit too eager for revenge, so when they saw a small band of enemy warriors, they threw caution to the wind and rode in pursuit. Colonel Fetterman led the charge, followed by 80 servicemen, some on foot, some on horseback. Once they made it over Pino Head Ridge and into the valley, they realized their folly, but by then it was too late. They were surrounded by 1,000 warriors who let loose their arrows from their bows and didn't stop until every soldier was dead. 9 months later, the forces led by Red Cloud and Crazy Horse tried their luck again, attacking a group of civilian woodcutters protected by army troops near Fort Phil Kearny. This became known as the Wagon Box Fight because the US soldiers placed their wagon boxes in a corral and used them for cover. Once again, the Great Plains warriors vastly outnumbered the army troops, but there was no one-sided slaughter this time. The soldiers were able to ward them off thanks to vastly superior firepower. They were armed with brand spanking new Springfield trapdoor rifles, capable of firing 5 to 10 times more rounds per minute than the older muzzle-loading guns. This was a long fight that lasted from morning until afternoon, and just like any old-fashioned western, it ended when the cavalry arrived. Eventually, the soldiers inside Fort Phil Kearny discovered the attack, and Major Benjamin Smith led a rescue mission with 100 men and a howitzer cannon. The Lakota knew that once the artillery started firing, it was time to count their losses and get out of Dodge. You would think that from then on, the US Army had the advantage in the war, but the reality was that the government wanted the conflict to be over as soon as possible. The whole reason why they were fighting in the first place was to protect the Bozeman Trail, used by pioneers and settlers to cross Montana and Wyoming. But after the Civil War, the Bozeman Trail just wasn't that big of a deal anymore. There was a new and better way to get around: the railroad. Maintaining a military presence in the area was a costly and unnecessary endeavor, so in 1868 the army abandoned the forts, which Red Cloud promptly set on fire. And seriously, who can blame him? The US government and the Sioux Nation then signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which recognized the lands as belonging to the Sioux, and they were super serious about not breaking the treaty this time, we swear. For a few years at least, there was peace between the United States and the Sioux. But all was not well for Crazy Horse because he was dealing with conflict at home and it almost got him killed. 2 members of his camp were a man named No Water and his wife Black Buffalo Woman, and they did not have a happy marriage. Black Buffalo Woman had a crush on Crazy Horse ever since she was a young girl, and her husband resented him for it. Adding to that, No Water was a mean drunk who sometimes beat his wife after having a few too many at the white man's trading post. Like his father and grandfather before him, Crazy Horse was a shirt wearer, meaning a community leader who was responsible for the protection and well-being of his people, especially those who were most vulnerable. So he first warned No Water to stop hurting Black Buffalo Woman, and when that didn't work, Crazy Horse convinced her to leave her husband and join him on a buffalo hunt. There, he asked for help from one of her relatives, Black Bear, and he agreed to take Black Buffalo Woman in and help her get back on her feet as an independent woman who don't need no man. When No Water heard about this, he pretty much reacted like you would expect. He picked up his gun and rode towards the buffalo hunt. Once there, he charged into Black Bear's teepee, aimed his pistol at Crazy Horse's heart, and pulled the trigger. Fortunately for Crazy Horse, his cousin Touch the Cloud was sitting near the teepee's entrance and had swift reactions. He grabbed No Water's arm and threw off his aim. The angry husband still managed to get off a shot, but instead of hitting Crazy Horse in the heart, it hit him in the face in his left cheek. Afterward, No Water managed to ride out of the camp, and although Crazy Horse's relatives chased after him, they couldn't catch him. Now, there were 2 problems to deal with: nursing Crazy Horse back to health and finding a solution for the conflict between him and No Water. The first one was straightforward. A chieftain named Spotted Tail offered the services of his niece, Black Shawl, to heal Crazy Horse since she had experience with bullet wounds. She stood by his side day and night, nursing and feeding him. The biggest problem was that Crazy Horse could not open his mouth to eat, so she fed him soup through a hollowed-out willow stick. Eventually, Crazy Horse made a full recovery, although he was left with a little memento of his near-fatal encounter in the form of a star-shaped scar on his cheek. But solving the second issue was trickier. Some of the elders thought that Crazy Horse was at fault for running away with another man's wife, even if the intention was to help her. Red Cloud himself came to the camp to discuss the matter, and this did not bode well for Crazy Horse, as there was some lingering animosity between them. Red Cloud might have received top billing during the war that was named after him, but he had lost a lot of authority with the Lakota. The young warriors in particular felt that Red Cloud was too eager to make peace with the American government and showed more respect toward Crazy Horse for displaying a more gung-ho attitude. Unsurprisingly, Red Cloud and the other elders ruled against Crazy Horse and demanded the shirt off his back. Literally. Crazy Horse was no longer a shirt wearer and had to turn in the ceremonial shirt that symbolized his position. In exchange, No Water had to pay him compensation for, shooting him in the face, and that was the end of the matter. Things didn't exactly work out for Crazy Horse, but every cloud has a silver lining. He and Black Shawl fell in love and got married. In 1871, Black Shawl gave birth to Crazy Horse's only known child, a girl named They Are Afraid of Her. What followed was a time of bliss for the Lakota leader, who doted on his offspring with every chance he'd get. But that bliss came to a sudden and heartbreaking end after just a few years, as They Are Afraid of Her died while still a toddler, stricken down by a coughing sickness, most likely cholera. But Crazy Horse did not have time to grieve in peace, because his people were now facing their greatest threat yet. The American government had discovered gold in the Black Hills. Everything changed once the gold rush hit the Dakota Territory. The US government knew how valuable that land was and wanted it at any cost. Peace treaties be damned. At first, they made a half-assed effort to keep settlers and prospectors out of the Black Hills. But the lure of gold was simply too tantalizing to pass up, and thousands of people still risked being caught by the army or killed by the Sioux for a chance at striking it rich. Then the army said it wouldn't stop prospectors anymore. Emboldened by this development, they began building illegal towns on Sioux land, with the most infamous of all being Deadwood, which we've covered in detail on our sister channel, Biographics. And then finally, the government decided to take the Black Hills and gave the Sioux a deadline to move into reservations. Of course, they refused, and thus the Great Sioux War began in February 1876. Red Cloud and the other elder Sioux leaders sat this one out. They tried to reach a diplomatic solution with the US government, and when that failed, they opted to stay on the reservations and left the fighting to the young guns such as Sitting Bull. Bio on him available if you're interested, Karl, and of course Crazy Horse. The first military operation against the Lakota and the Cheyenne began in March, but Crazy Horse had no involvement. It certainly didn't go the way the army had hoped, and after a defeat at the Battle of Powder River, military command decided to err on the side of caution, retreat, regroup, and retry. The second expedition was launched in the summer and was much grander than the first. 3 armies marched simultaneously from different forts, one led by General Alfred Terry, one by Colonel John Gibbon, and one by General George Crook. Ostensibly, the plan was to converge on the Sioux's hunting grounds at the same time and trap them in the middle. The timing didn't quite work out, though. The column, led by General Crook, was approaching its destination from the south from Fort Fetterman. Once it reached a valley along the Rosebud Creek, Crook gave the order to stop the march and allow the rear guard to catch up and to rest the horses. The animals were grazing and the soldiers were blissfully taking in the morning sun when a Sioux army led by Crazy Horse descended upon them. Crook's salvation here was his Native American allies, the Crow and the Shoshone, who feared an ambush and were ready to fight. Crook had a few hundred of them in his retinue, and they warded off the Sioux long enough for the rest of the army to regroup and prevent the Battle of the Rosebud from turning into a complete bloodbath. Eventually, after inflicting enough damage, Crazy Horse gave the order to retreat. His warriors had killed 28 enemies and injured dozens more, but more importantly, the battle kept Crook's army out of action for weeks. The infamous battle that cemented Crazy Horse's legacy happened just 8 days later, on June 25, 1876, by a river known as the Little Bighorn. The 7th Cavalry Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, had broken off from the main force, led by General Terry, to flank the enemy. On June 24th, Custer's scouts located one of the main Sioux encampments. Initially, Custer hoped for a surprise attack, but there was no way he could keep his army's movements a secret from the Sioux in their own neck of the woods. When he realized he was discovered, Custer feared that any hesitation would give the enemy time to either launch a counterattack or scatter to the winds. Not wanting either to happen, he decided to attack as soon as possible. Since the Battle of the Little Bighorn is better known as Custer's last stand, you can guess how well that worked out for him. Custer had around 700 men under his command, and he divided them into 4 segments. One was a supply train, one was led by Captain Frederick Benteen, one by Major Marcus Reno, and the largest one, around 210 soldiers, by Custer himself. Benteen's unit was to march southwest, search for any other Sioux in the area, attack them, and then return. Reno was to lead the initial charge into the village, supported by Custer's troops. On the Sioux side, they didn't keep the same strict order of battle, so we're not sure who did what. But we do know that all 3 major Lakota leaders were present for the fight: Sitting Bull, Karl, and Crazy Horse, plus many others from the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. Reno was the first to attack, but the Native Americans quickly stopped his assault and then kept pushing him back. Eventually, after his troops had broken up and suffered heavy losses, he gave the order to retreat and cross the Little Bighorn River. There he rendezvoused with Captain Benteen. but Custer's forces were trapped amid all the fighting with no way out. It wasn't until the following day, when the rest of the expedition, led by Generals Terry and Gibbon, arrived on the scene that they were able to return to the battlefield. They confirmed their worst fear. Custer's troops had been killed to the last man. As we said, we don't know exactly what role Crazy Horse played in Custer's last stand, although a first-person account from Arapaho warrior Waterman later described the Lakota chief as the bravest man I ever saw. He rode closest to the soldiers, yelling to his warriors. All the soldiers were shooting at him, but he was never hit. It was the greatest victory that the Native Americans ever scored against the United States, but it also made the military step up their efforts. They began pursuing the Sioux deep into Lakota territory, not allowing them to set up any long-term camps. This was brutally effective during the winter since the Native Americans had to stay on the move in freezing temperatures and didn't have time to hunt for food. Eventually, the threat of starvation or exposure forced many Native Americans to accept life on the reservation, and Crazy Horse was no different. On May 7, 1877, he and over 1,000 of his followers showed up at Fort Robinson in Nebraska and surrendered. They were placed at the nearby Red Cloud Agency, but Crazy Horse's stay was brief and ended in tragedy. Something happened 4 months later, and we're not really sure what. Some claim that Crazy Horse left the reservation without authorization, others that he kept encouraging the rest to revolt, and some say that it was a simple miscommunication caused by a mistranslation. September 5th, 1877, Crazy Horse was brought here from Spotted Tail today. Prisoner was mortally wounded in trying to escape about dark and died about midnight. His father and Touch the Cloud were with him till he died. After he had ceased to breathe, Touch the Cloud placed his hand on Crazy Horse's breast and said, "Washtela, it is good. He has looked for death, and it has come." I hope you learned something today, and if you dug today's video, deploy your likes, comment a historical figure we should cover next, subscribe and ring that bell if you haven't, and share this video with someone who enjoys learning about historical figures. And thanks again to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. Remember to follow the link in the description and pinned comment to get 20% off your subscription. It's a small price to pay to help keep your private data safe from bad actors. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.